Hi everyone, my name is Sam Sharp. I am a graduate student at Kansas State University, and I'm very excited to talk to you about developing LGBTQIA plus inclusive biology classrooms and curricula. I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. So I am recording this talk on stolen land as an uninvited guest. The land that I am on near Kansas State University is the current home to 4 federally recognized Native nations: the Prairie Band Potawatomi, the Kickapoo Tribe of Kansas, the Iowa Tribe of Kansas and Nebraska, and the Sac and Fox Nation of Missouri and Kansas and Nebraska. I'd like to thank the K-State Indigenous Faculty and Staff Alliance for writing the land acknowledgement from which mine is adapted. Additionally, given the topic of this talk, as we discuss cultivating respectful attitudes and practices to support sex and gender diversity, that we acknowledge European colonists historically targeted, stigmatized, and oppressed Indigenous peoples for having cultural roles beyond the gender binary, and that this violence continues today. I'd next like to share a quote from the feminist scholar Sarah Ahmed, who writes, "We learn about worlds when they do not accommodate us. Not being accommodated can be pedagogy. We generate ideas through the struggles we have to be in the world, and we come to question worlds when we are in question." And this quote really resonates with me because during the time that I've been a graduate student and instructor, many aspects of the biology curricula that I was given to teach felt really unaccommodating to me for a variety of ways. And through that experience of being consistently not accommodated, it's generated questions that have led to the talk that I'm giving today. So some of the common issues of inclusion that I have encountered while teaching and also previously being a student in biology courses include issues of how sex is discussed. So frequently, sex is discussed as a male-female binary that's determined at conception, categorical and static, consistent across animals and plants without presenting any variety or nuance. And the existence of intersex people is either ignored completely or is expressed only through these really dehumanizing photos of naked intersex people with black bars across their faces. Um, so these are some illustrations indicating the way that we just see male-female sex binary presented across all kinds of taxa without context. When gender is mentioned in biology classes, it's often described as something that's biologically determined by sex at birth. The way that the terms sex and gender are used is often conflated, sometimes randomly. Sometimes we see weird uses of the word gender to refer to plants. Still don't understand why, even though I'm a plant biologist. And we often see gender stereotypes projected onto non-human organisms. When sexuality comes up in biology classes, it's always described in a reproductively focused way. It's explicitly or implicitly heterosexual. Queerness is ignored completely or associated with animals making mistakes about who to attempt to mate with. Or sometimes in the case of humans, we only get a mention of queerness in a biology textbook on the topic of HIV/AIDS. And looking at this diagram, that brings me to my last point, which is that when we see imagery of people in biology textbooks, the drawings are often showing muscular, non-disabled white men and women, like this person in this chart of hominid evolution. And as I mentioned before, we often see when intersex people are included, it's through these really dehumanizing naked photos. So there's a lot of problems going on here with the way that sex, gender, sexuality, and human diversity generally is presented in biology textbooks. And changing that completely is a lot of work that will require multiple different types of efforts and honestly a paradigm shift. And a lot of us are currently beginning our teaching semesters. So when I was planning how to give this talk, I decided that the goal would be, rather than taking everyone through the history of how we got to where we are now, I'm instead going to focus on what are some small operationalizable changes that we can all make in our courses today to make them more inclusive, because there's a variety of barriers that exist to changing these curricula, which many instructors very fairly do not feel equipped to address all at once. So frequently we have to cram in a lot of content, and there's really not time to add anything extra when we have specific learning objectives or curricula that needs to be gotten through. The teaching materials that we're given are not inclusive, and we either cannot choose our own teaching materials, or there are simply no inclusive ones available on a specific topic. A lot of people are concerned that they don't know enough about sex, gender, and sexuality diversity to teach it in a way that's accurate and helpful. And many folks feel pressured to keep things that are perceived as identity or politics out of STEM, which I find really frustrating, because not talking about these things is still enforcing one set of political views and ideas about what identity means. And finally, there are very real concerns about pushback, and depending on who your population of students are, this can be a very real concern, and especially for instructors who themselves come from historically underrepresented populations, wanting to avoid pushback can be a very legitimate priority. So what I will be presenting in the rest of this talk is hopefully ways that ideas about sex, gender, and sexuality diversity can be incorporated into the curriculum to make courses more accurate and more inclusive without having to fully dismantle the structures and systems that keep these barriers in place. And so the way that I've chosen to approach this is to go through some different components of many biology courses across levels and topics that we're probably already talking about, and giving some examples of ways to add sex and gender diversity content when discussing these topics. So the first one I will talk about is diversity and variation. So a basic biological principle is that life on Earth is extremely diverse, and organisms utilize a vast variety of ways to accomplish biological tasks. And the way this connects to sex and gender diversity is that humans have multiple different physical traits related indirectly or directly to sexual reproduction, and all of these traits vary along a spectrum. And this is a graphic from Interact showing secondary sex characteristics in the outer circles and primary sex characteristics in the internal circles. All of these vary along a spectrum. An example of this is the Quigley scale, which shows some ways that external genital structures can vary along a spectrum. So normalizing this variation in the way that we talk about other aspects of variation within biological diversity. The next topic is development throughout the lifespan. So a biological principle that many of us teach is that organisms move through different life stages, which may include changes in shape, size, appearance, behavior, social role, and more. And one way to connect this to sex and gender diversity is that sex is not a static trait. Humans aren't born with the same sex traits they have during puberty, they have during young adulthood, or they have during a more elderly phase of life. And some species do even more and can switch from an adult of one sex to an adult of another sex. Cool example of this is clownfish, which can fully change from a reproductive adult of one sex to a reproductive adult of another sex during a single lifetime. Another topic many of us discuss is interactions between organisms. So organisms interact with conspecifics, organisms in different species, and the ecological environment in interesting ways. This can be connected to sex and gender diversity by thinking about different types of sexual reproduction and different types of sex outside of reproduction, both of which occur in many different species in many different ways. An example of same-sex interactions in a non-human species would be penguins, including these gay penguins at a zoo in Denmark. Thinking about science and society, something that most of us are at least somewhat aware of in our research and teaching is the way that biology as a field of scientific inquiry influences and is influenced by the society in which science is done, and how the specific values of that society and culture impact it. And the way we think about sex and gender diversity are very much a product of a specific cultural history, and the ways that queerness, gender nonconformity, and intersex variation have been seen as threats is very much related to eugenic goals around creating and maintaining this ideal of white masculinity and femininity. I really suggest everyone learns more about this history. You're welcome to email me for more resources on it, because it's very influential to a lot of what we would think of as either common sense or biology, but is actually a specific historical and cultural value. One way to bring up this connection in class is to discuss how in some states there's legislation about what K-12 students can learn in terms of things like sex ed. So In this Louisiana bill, it states that you're allowed to teach factual biological or pathological information about things like the human reproductive system, pregnancy, or STDs. However, you cannot talk about homosexuality because that's considered explicit rather than biological. So context dependence is a big part of biological diversity. So we are aware that there's no universally adaptive traits or behaviors. It all depends on whether they're adaptive within their specific biological context. And what it means to be male or female varies across species. There's no context independent multi-trait phenotype of being male or female, which is consistent in every anisogamic species. So we must always understand sex contextually within a specific system. And in humans, we have at least 7 different variable traits that are related to biological sex. And we always need to understand how these traits are interpreted through human values about gender. So one aspect of human sex that varies on a spectrum is the length of the phalloclitoris at birth. There's no biological reason why it can't be between 3/8 of an inch and 1 inch at birth. However, because of cultural expectations about gender, unnecessary and traumatic surgeries are still performed on many infants who are born with this specific type of biological variation due to the cultural context through which this biological trait is seen as a threat to the gender binary. Another topic in biology that will often be covered is the simultaneous utility and limitation of categories. So most of us agree that the species concept is useful but imperfect. Sex and gender categories can also be useful and are definitely limited and can be misused. An example of this would be thinking about SICB 2023. It might be useful to collect data on which gender category individuals who attended the conference identify with to see if that influenced whether they had a good time at the conference or not. However, collecting this data on gender category identification would be a bad way to try and figure out how many people at the conference had a cervix. This might seem like a ridiculous example, but frequently the way that sex and gender are conflated can result in these categories being misused in examples like this. And finally, adaptation and plasticity is a big part of biodiversity, allowing change to happen both over evolutionary time and during an individual's lifespan. Different systems of reproduction can also be adapted to local environments and in some cases are plastic. So for certain individuals, it's advantageous to reproduce asexually. For other individuals, sexual reproduction is more advantageous. Some individuals, such as rotifers, are able to do either depending on the current environmental conditions. And finally, discovery and integration of new knowledge. So we're aware that the biological consensus can change as we learn more. An example of this would be, hopefully, as we're learning the problems and inaccuracies of the sex and gender binary, our understandings are shifting. A great talk at SICB that I heard was Dr. Urbanu Subramaniam's talk about how plant sex and reproduction cannot be fully understood when studied through the superimposed lens of human sexuality. And hopefully we can move towards an understanding of plant sex diversity that goes beyond that. Some other things you can do to make your classrooms more inclusive are asking about things like student name, pronouns, and accessibility needs, clarifying your commitment to inclusion, pointing out if texts are not inclusive. If you have a typo in the text, you probably point that out to students. You can also point out an example of a text not being inclusive in the same way. Avoiding gendering non-human organisms and applying human gender stereotypes to them. You should always go into your courses assuming that you do have queer, trans, and intersex students, even if they're not out to you, and continuing to advocate for LGBTQIA+ students in every different example of diversity initiatives, programming, and inclusion at your institution. And with that, I'd like to thank everyone for listening to my recorded talk and invite you to contact me either through the SICB Plus platform, through my email, or through Twitter. Thanks again.